The latest is that we had a venue all set up, and we paid. We had an agreement in place, and the venue owner knew who we were. There was no big surprises. And then very shortly afterwards, and I'm sure this is no coincidence, very shortly after we released where the venue was going to be, which we have to do late because of security concerns, within an hour or so, the venue owner was screaming at our people and telling them to get out of the venue, or he was going to have them arrested for trespassing and so on. And so what transpired from the guy who's hosted Marilyn Manson and who says his venue is like a blank slate or a blank space where people can come, a big pro free speech guy, what happened between when we released the name of the venue to when he's screaming abuse at us, clearly terrified out of his mind. That is the big question. What happened in that hour between us releasing the name of the venue and him calling us to cancel? If I had to put money on it, I'd guess he was threatened. And if that is true, then that means that it was the use or threat of violence in pursuit of political ends, straight up terrorism.
This is public feedback though, isn't it? Would he not have received public or feedback from the public that they didn't want you at this event?
People do want us at the event. We sold out.
What do you make of the response that you've received since you've been in New Zealand?
We've had overwhelming positive response of people supporting our free speech, wanting us to be allowed to give our opinions, even people who disagree with us saying we should be allowed to. And this is what's so shocking, is this venue owner, it was unlike many of the other venues we've done speeches at. He called us and said, absolutely, this is a free speech venue, happy to have you here, to a complete flip, to just a terrified man. Terrified, which means that even if it's not the majority of New Zealanders, and there was a poll recently that showed that the majority of people in New Zealand support our free speech, there is a violent and scary minority of people here that are willing to make threats and commit violence for the sake of shutting down free speech. And this is the question, will New Zealand let those people win? Will New Zealand let those people decide what the majority get to hear, what questions they get to ask, what speeches they get to attend? Right now that answer is yes.
Do you care that you're being shut down?
Of course, we care for free speech, we care for the principles, we care for the civilized debate that is supposed to characterize a modern society, and we care for the people who've flown in, people who've made sacrifices to come and see us. We care for the audience. We care on just about every single conceivable level because, of course, as you know, Ryan, if we're kind of a test case, right? So there are some disagreements about the arguments that I've made, about the arguments that Lauren have made, reasoned arguments with copious, well-sourced data and so on. We're allowed to come and make arguments that people dislike. That's part of civilization. And if they dislike it, they can come and protest peacefully. They can come and ask us hard questions in the Q&A, which is exactly what they have been doing. They can write articles and so on, making reasoned cases against what we're saying. What they don't get to do, well, they don't get to slander, they don't get to libel, and they sure as hell don't get to threaten violence, to shut down an event if that's what happened.
People on social media are calling you racist and even describing you to Adolf Hitler. Is what you're doing hate speech?
Hate speech has no meaning anymore. If I were a suffragette, I would have been slandered and called all sorts of names for opposing what was the acceptable social order at the time. If I criticized Christianity hundreds of years ago, that would have been considered blasphemy. Anyone who questions what is the current order at the time of elites and what the media and the government has decided will be considered hateful of that establishment. What we are doing is not hateful. We are making well-reasoned debates. We are asking questions. We are having important discussions that have led to the creation of the greatest civilization on earth through finding the best ideas. But now the current order has changed to one that supports progressivism and multiculturalism. And this idea of multiculturalism is so inherently volatile that it cannot afford to be questioned. So it has decided to call any questions of it hate speech. And that is exactly what is occurring here.
The word hate is not an argument. It's fundamentally what it is. We're making reasoned arguments with data, with syllogisms, good Socratic method. Putting the word hate in front of us is not an argument. It simply shows that people are actually unfit to participate in an intellectual debate if they think that that is some sort of response to reasoned arguments.
What do you make of New Zealand's biculturalism, let alone multiculturalism?
Biculturalism is a fascinating question. We have it in Canada as well, but in almost every case, one culture dominates the other. English is the predominant language here. You certainly aren't using Maori sense of property rights here today. You're using kind of Western cultural English, British laws and values as the majority. There is still a preservation of Maori culture, but for the most part, New Zealand is a Western culture. And the only reason that there's some preservation of Indigenous cultures in places like Canada and New Zealand is because Western European culture is one of the most tolerant cultures in the entire world. Had New Zealand been discovered by Genghis Khan or some Islamic ruler, I think it would be a very different fate for the Maori people. And we should be quite thankful that in places like New Zealand and Australia and Canada, Europeans with a long cultivated culture of Western tolerance are the majority.
Let me just add one thing, because for me, I'm a very, very small government kind of guy. I welcome and respect and enjoy the participation of different cultures in a society. When you have a multicultural society with a big, powerful government that has the capacity to transfer hundreds of billions of dollars from various groups, then you end up with what would be the equivalent in the West in history of religious civil wars, right? When the government was able to control religion within a particular country, then each religious group was striving to gain control of that government in order to impose its view of religion on everyone else, or to avoid having someone else's view of religion imposed upon them. And what that produced was century after century of religious warfare that the West finally survived by separating church and state and saying we can't have the state legislate religion because it produces endless conflict. A separation of state and economics, a separation of state and culture is essential for us to live peacefully with each other. Otherwise, every single culture, just like every single historical religion in Europe and around the world these days, is going to try and gain control of the state to benefit itself and to punish its enemies. We need to shrink the power of the state, reduce its influence over culture and the economy so we can all live together more peacefully.
In saying that, just going back to the West and its dominance here in New Zealand, essentially they tried to wipe out Māori culture.
How so?
The language was banned. People weren't allowed to teach it within our schools.
Government schools. See the problem? No, this is government schools.
But then land was also taken and confiscated from Māori as well. Is that fair?
And you say that everyone says biculturalism, multiculturalism, these are things that work. They quite frankly don't. History has shown that there will always be a culture that will fight for dominance. Always. And the majority tend to be the one who decide what the laws become and what the future of the nation becomes. So we're here to ask those questions. Is that fair? I don't know. We want to have that conversation. We want the ability to say, do you want this to happen to your current culture? A lot of people enjoy what New Zealand culture has become today. If suddenly another group comes in and becomes the majority, will they dictate what your language is? Will they dictate what your laws are? Most likely, yes. That's a question that you need to answer and you need to have discussions about. But right now it looks like that discussion is censored by calling it hate speech, by comparing it to literally Hitler, by calling anyone who tries to question this bicultural or multicultural future a bigot. No, these are important questions. I don't care if you're coming at it from a left-wing or a right-wing perspective, but let's consider all of them so that we can come to a conclusion of how our nations should go forward.
Let me address some more specific things that you brought up there, because very, very important questions. So first of all, it would be government schools, I would assume, where the language was either promoted or banned. And that's another example of government control over culture. The government should have no control over education. It should be all up to parents, local communities, churches, communities, you name it. Number two, there were treaties that were made with the Maori people. I know this in particular because having studied the Aborigines in Australia quite considerably for the last leg of the tour, I did find out that the Aborigines were the only continent where these treaties were not made. So if the treaties were made with the Maoris, then of course they should have been maintained. If they weren't maintained, that's an example of how bad and fickle government is with regards to managing cultures, managing interactions between cultures, which is very, very bad. Now, as far as wiping out goes, the illnesses and so on, this is just a virgin soil epidemic. There was no theory of germ warfare. There was no even theory of germs. They weren't discovered until much later after the settlement of New Zealand and Australia. So there was no particular goal like, oh, let's get these smallpox blankets and hand them out. There's no record of anything like that. And so the idea that there was some concerted effort to wipe out the indigenous population, you know, I mean, Europeans pretty efficient at things. If that was the goal, it's hard to explain how there are still so many. And it's also hard to explain that as soon as modern medicines were available to give to the indigenous populations, they were handed out. And the population growth began again. It was in Australia in the 1930s, I assume similar time here. So these are just important questions, and the question also arises, how long do historical wrongs have to be righted? If it's wrong to use coercion to transfer resources from one group to another, is it fair that the Maoris are getting, I think it was $56 million in the New Zealand budget for Maori affairs? I'm sure it's more, but that's just all I could sort of legitimately find. Is that fair that people here who have nothing to do with past wrongs are collectively judged and held liable morally for things that happened by people who may be completely unrelated to them hundreds of years ago? At some point, we do have to let historical wrongs go. Otherwise, my concern is it just becomes this endless salt in an endless wound where people never end up getting along.
Do you think New Zealand should do away with its treaty?
I think that everybody should be free to pursue their own happiness, their own joy, their own property, their own opportunities in a free market. I do not believe in collective moral guilt. I do not believe in the inheritance of the original sin of other people from hundreds of years ago. I wish to be judged morally as an individual, not by my skin color, not by what my ancestors may or may not have done in this continent or some other continent. And so everybody should be free. Freedom is the solution for everyone.
All right. What were you going to present tonight?
Oh, I just finished my speech, actually. I think if I...
I was hoping to present a well-mannered discussion about both biculturalism and multiculturalism, its merits and its shortcomings. And I think this is a question that is so crucial right now, because if we don't answer it now, these questions of identity are not going away. What will our future look like? What language will we be speaking? What laws will we be ruled by? Is our identity based on gender, religion, culture, values, whatever it may be? We need to answer this question now, because if we go forward making decisions about our nation without these answers, we could end up anywhere. We could end up with a culture that completely does not value the rights of women, like much of the Islamic world, if we continue immigration from these areas. We could end up with a culture that is completely abusive to workers, that has a communist system, if we allow immigration from countries that, for the most part, support and bring up these communist systems. We need to decide what the future of our nations are now, so that we can save us from a difficult future where there are these intercultural battle lines drawn between people, where there could potentially be bloodshed over the fate of the Western world. I just wanted a discussion with people so that we can help save our children and their grandchildren, and potentially the whole Western world and culture.
I was going to do the greatest speech I've ever written. And the speeches have been very, very well received so far, but you can get it on YouTube. I'm going to be recording it anyway, and I hope that people will check it out, because it's very, very important stuff.